Book 3, Part 9. A truck pulled up next to us, and I heard Cal. "We'll have to put her in the back. There's no way we can get her inside the truck." "I'll ride in back with her," Phil growled. "So will I," came Jackson's voice. "Here, put her on the blanket, and then we can lift that," came Will's voice. I watched them lay out a dark green blanket, and then Phil moved closer to me. I felt other hands slide under me, and I cried out as they lifted me and moved me to the blanket. It was only seconds, but my body flared with the pain, and I howled from it. Then they lifted the blanket and hurried me to the back of the truck. By the time I was settled in, my head was spinning from the pain, which only made the pain from my actual injuries worse. The smell of wood, sap, and pine needles tickled my nose, and I sneezed, which also sent shards of pain through me. Phil sat next to my head, and the truck lurched as it started out. "Once you're healed, I'm gonna beat you right back senseless," Track snapped, laying down next to me. His wolf eyes glared at me, but he moved closer as my body started to shake. I guess the shock was wearing off. My legs spasmed, and I panted so hard I could barely catch my breath. Phil laid his hand gently on my head, but I didn't look up at him. We were moving slowly, but I still felt every single bump and dip. "So, what exactly did you think you were doing?" I opened my eyes and looked at the brown wolf lying next to me. I needed some time to think, I thought back. Phil sighed above me, but I ignored it. Track chuckled. "How about saying, 'Hey guys, I need some time to think'?" A low growl came out of my chest, and he snorted, which was his way of laughing. "Yeah, okay, so this went on the top of my idiot moves list. Well, not the very top. The night I snuck out and went to Polson still held that trophy, but this definitely got the silver medal." Track nudged me with his muzzle, and I whimpered, moving my head closer. I was in pain. Lots and lots of pain. All self-inflicted. My pride was not something I was too worried about at the moment. Ryan and Rock were on 4 legs and were leaning against my back to keep me stable and warm. Jackson was sitting behind Track and would look over the side of the truck a lot. Suddenly, we hit a large bump, and I screamed out, throwing my head up. Hands landed on me, holding me in place, and Phil yelled something at the driver. "We're almost there," somebody up front yelled back. "We're off the paved road now, but we'll take it as slow as we can." Another bump, and I gripped my teeth and closed my eyes. The pain was either easing up a bit, or had overloaded all my senses to where I couldn't tell what was what. It was more likely the second option. Wolves and vampires healed fast, but not that fast. Chapter 10. When the truck finally rolled to a stop, I let out a small sigh. The last part of the trip had been rough. There was a lot of activity around me, and everyone talked at once. Track was laying in front of me and finally moved when Phil knelt. "One more move, and then you can settle in," he smiled, trying to make eye contact with me. I moved my head, looked at Track, and then closed my eyes. I didn't cry out when they lifted me, or when they walked me into the cabin. That doesn't mean it didn't hurt, but it was easing up a bit, and humiliation and guilt were working their way back in. I was well back to self-loathing when they laid me on my bed. "We need to get her cleaned up so we can look at her wounds." That was Tom Tom talking now. Someone was throwing more wood on the fire, and the room was heating up quickly. How are we going to clean her here? That was Jackson talking now. She's filthy. Gee, thanks, I mumbled, and Track snorted. I glanced at where he stood, with his head over the side of the bed. Maybe we can put her in the tub. Yikes, that was one of Cal's clique. Was everyone in here? She can't stand up in that thing, Jackson shot back. Then we'll lay her in it. Ugh, that was Ryan. He had shifted back. He stepped up and pushed Track over a bit with his leg. We need to clean her off, and without a proper bathroom, that tub will have to do. Will turned and yelled to somebody to start getting the water ready. Her front leg is broken, Ryan, Jackson snapped. You can't put her... Then our alpha's growl filled the room, and I whimpered, trying to tuck my tail under me, which didn't work. She is vampire and werewolf. The leg will heal. The wounds will heal, Ryan said in a low, tight voice. But if she has open wounds and they heal dirty... Ah, yeah, that was the tricky part. We healed fast, which was good, but if open wounds didn't get cleaned out, then it was bad. I had never had it happen, but I had heard stories. I saw Aaron and David bring in the tub and set it near the fire. Marcus and Mark already had buckets of steaming water, and I wondered if they had expected me to get hurt. I sighed. I couldn't blame them if I did. It's usually what happened these days. The room filled with light, and another man walked over with 2 large lanterns in his hands. Tom Tom took one, and Phil took the other. They lifted them up, and I closed my eyes tight against the light. The blood is from that front break, and a few dozen scratches, Ryan said in a tight voice as he inspected me. A few are deep, but most are already trying to close. I felt him run his hands through my fur, and my body shook. She's covered in thorns and burrs. He continued his assessment of me, and then worked his way to my head, where he let out a long sigh. Aside from the broken leg, her head took the worst of it. Good thing you have such a hard one, Track teased, and I opened my eyes and looked down at him. He was still on 4 legs, and his eyes were trying to be playful. Ryan moved his hand over my brows, down my jaw, under it, and up between my ears. About a dozen gashes, I think a few fractures, and I stopped trying to count the lumps. He looked down at me and shook his head. I don't know if you are very lucky or very unlucky, he chuckled, and I whimpered again, lifting my head a little to nudge his arm that was on the bed. What are we going to do with you? He smiled, and my heart nearly stopped. People were saying that about me a lot. My dad, Track, Jonathan, Phil, and now my Alpha. I felt my throat tighten and closed my eyes. Monster. That's what I was. A horrible, cruel monster that played with 2 wonderful hearts and constantly caused everyone around me to alter their lives because of something stupid I did. I really wish wolves could cry. I could use it right now. The whimpers coming from my throat were not the same. There was no release from that. My pack was here when they should have been in Polson. My dad was probably tearing through cities, mad with worry. Jonathan, I moaned. If he was smart, he had packed up my stuff and shipped it back to the manor. More water sloshed by the fire, and I swallowed hard. She needs some water, Phil stated. A minute later, someone brought over a shallow bowl with cool water. I lifted my head and lapped it up, spilling most of it, but it did taste good. "The tub's ready," Marcus stated, and Ryan nodded, then looked at me. "This is gonna hurt, but we need to get you clean. Then you can rest." I lifted my head, happy it didn't spin quite so much, and then tried to push myself up. "Whoa there," he chuckled, putting a hand on my back. "That front leg is broken, Raina." Yeah, that would account for the ice-hot pain that seared through it just now. But I was determined not to be any more of a problem than I had been. A plan was starting to form in my mind. Not any one single plan. I actually couldn't think completely clearly yet, but the need to grasp onto something was there. I staggered again, this time using my other 3 limbs. Phil went to grab me, but Ryan shook his head. I did love my alpha. He knew why I needed to do this, and he was letting me try. I felt the tenseness from the others, and Track gave a small bark. "I'm good," I thought to him, my legs wobbling under me, but they held. My front right paw was lifted, and I kept it that way. Being stubborn was one thing. Stupid? Well, I had had my fill of that for right now. I straightened my other legs more, and then lifted my head a little. Ryan smiled and winked at me, making my tongue flop out. Phil stepped into view, and I turned my head away, trying to make my way to the edge of the bed. It must have been a painful sight, because Jackson cursed, and Marcus tried to step up. Ryan's growls stopped them both. Then I jumped, causing our alpha to even shout at me. I landed hard and winced, my broken leg angry and the rest of me teetering from it. But I stood, and that was something. "Are you mad?" Rock hissed, walking over to me on 4 legs. "You shouldn't have done that." I lowered my head and then snorted. "I'm okay. Well, most of me is," I thought back defensively. Then I turned and hobbled over towards the tub. Okay, so I wasn't going to be able to hop into that. The sides were as high as my chest. I knew if I tried, I would slip and crash, and my body was not willing to do that again so soon. Track snorted next to me, and I turned. He stepped up and put his head over the side. "It's not too deep. I think you should be safe." I nipped at his neck and then stiffened when I heard Phil's voice. I still couldn't bring myself to look at him. How was he managing to even be in the same room with me, knowing? How could he whisper that he... I swallowed hard and lowered my head. It didn't matter now. I was a horrible person. Jonathan was wonderful and amazing. And Phil, I sighed. He had my heart and always would. But neither of them deserved to be stuck with me. "Whoa!" I barked as arms moved under me and lifted me up and over into the tub. "Easy, Tay," Phil laughed as my legs flew out from the shock and sent water flying everywhere. But his word made me freeze. I was standing in the tub now, the water halfway up my legs, and I shivered. "Crap, is the water too cold?" Jackson growled, sticking his hand in it. No, the water was fine, nice and warm. I was the one that wasn't okay. He had called me Tay. I lowered my head in shame and then snorted and coughed when my muzzle hit the water. "We better work fast before she drowns herself," Ryan chuckled. Then I felt several hands on me. They used washcloths and shampoo and scrubbed me down as best they could, the water quickly turning brown. There was a plug at the far end of the tub, but of course they couldn't drain it right here. Jackson ran off and came back with part of a hose and a handful of plastic buckets. He shook one end of the hose at me. "You know I love you," he stated as he put one end into the tub and held the other to his mouth. I tilted my head. What in the world was he going to do? Drink this filthy tub water? I barked at him, but he winked and then sucked. My eyes widened. Wow, he was going to drink it. Suddenly, he yanked the hose away from his mouth and lowered it into one of the buckets. I heard the water sloshing into it and felt the water in the tub move. Okay, that was pretty cool. I barked again and he chuckled. "You are a very sheltered pup." Aaron grabbed the bucket and Jackson moved his siphon to another one. The water in the tub lowered. They did this until there was only a bit swimming around my paws. Then Aaron, Marcus, Mark, and Jackson brought the buckets back, filled with fresh, warm water. They poured these over me slowly, while Ryan and Phil worked the last of the dirt and shampoo out. Another load of bathtub water through the giant straw, and a final rinse. I couldn't help but wonder where they were heating all this water from so fast. After washing my face and head off with a large cloth, Ryan finally seemed satisfied. My body stung in places, still throbbed in others, but it felt good to be clean. He bent over and looked at me. "Now to towel dry you, then clean up those wounds." "And then kick her glass princess butt for running off," Jackson snapped, and then winked again when I looked at him. My head lowered. Yeah, I did have that coming, and not just for running off. Being hefted out didn't hurt as bad, and I made sure to keep my right front leg up. Seems the rest of me, minus some lumps and pains in my head and jaw, was already working its magic and healing. My muscles were still not happy with me. They ached, and I yawned in response. I was as exhausted as they were. Track's head lowered under my jaw, and I rubbed against him. "I am so tired," I thought. "I bet you are," he chuckled, as he rubbed against the side of my jaw that was less sore. Towels were scrubbed over me, and that felt really good. It was drying me off, but also working the blood through my body. That helped me warm up and also helped the healing process. My muscles just needed sleep, and the small cuts and scratches were mending themselves quickly. "Get the tub out," Ryan stated, and Marcus and Jackson quickly picked up the massive tub and walked it through the door. Cal threw a few blankets in front of the fire, and I hopped over to it and moaned as I laid down. The heat from the fire felt good, and so did collapsing in front of it. Tom knelt in front of me. "I am not a healer," he smiled, "but I know a thing or two. Let's have a look at that leg, shall we?" He held out his hand and waited. I slowly lifted my injured leg and laid it in his hand. His touch was so soft that I only winced a few times. "There's more than one break here," he stated, but his voice was calm, almost soothing, and I actually yawned again. "We need a healer," Cal stated, and then I remembered that their healers were back with our pack. Somewhere. "Call David and have them brought back," Ryan stated, kneeling with a duffel bag next to him. A Raina-sized first aid kit. That thought made me chuckle a bit. "All of them?" Cal asked carefully, and I looked up. Ryan smiled at me and then nodded. Cal and Marcus left the room quickly. Where in the world are they going to get cell reception out here? I thought to myself. You'd be surprised. I turned, and Track wiggled his wolf brows. It needs to be splinted for now, Tom said, but he was smiling. The healers can decide once they get here. For now, we just need to keep it still. He looked at me and chuckled. I wonder if that's possible. Down went my tail and then my head. He told one of the guys to get something out of the other room, then turned to Ryan. They have splinting stuff here. Ryan nodded and then looked at me. Yeah, I was wondering when he was going to tell me off. The not knowing was a bit unnerving. Hungry? My eyes widened. That wasn't what I was expecting. He seemed to realize and shrugged. That will come. Trust me. Right now I want you fed, cleaned, and rested. So you're healthy when he beat you senseless, Rock chuckled, and I moaned. Hey, that's my job, Track barked playfully at him, and I turned to look at the fire. It was okay. Whatever happened, I would take it. They couldn't do more than I deserved. It just wasn't possible at this point. Someone brought a bowl of meat, and I ate while Tom and Ryan splinted my leg. I lapped up a bowl of water and then yawned again, hardly able to keep my eyes open now. Let's get her on the bed, the elder said, as he put the things away in a wooden box. No, please, I barked. I'm so comfortable right here. Phil translated, and I winced. I had forgotten about that. Ryan sighed, and they both stood. Get some blankets and scoot her back from the fire a bit, our alpha stated, and more feet started to rush around. They pulled the rug, with me on it, a yard back from the fire. That way I was warm enough without being too warm. They laid down several blankets, and I finally plopped down on them, sighing heavily. I heard some pounding and then looked up, seeing a board over the empty window pane. Yikes, I forgot about that too. Not to worry, Will smiled, squatting next to me. You're not the first wolf to cause so much excitement, and I doubt you'll be the last, he chuckled. And Cal knelt next to him. Me and Aaron caught one of the cabins on fire when we were younger, he confessed. Burnt it to the ground, and almost caught 2 others off it. Will shook his head. Like I said, you won't be the last either, so forget that guilt I see coated all over your face. Oh, I didn't know it was that obvious. I blinked and then reached out and nudged his hand. He chuckled again and pat my head. You're amazing. Don't forget that. My punishment started then, but it didn't come from Ryan. Track stepped up and started to tell me off. He continued as the room emptied, everyone grabbing a handful of towels or a few buckets, but no one stopped him. He paced between me and the fire, ranting about what could have happened, how stupid it was, and I let him. I laid on my stomach, my jaw on my good leg, and let him berate me. I glanced at the door once, seeing it partially opened. He didn't seem to appreciate the distraction and nipped at one of my ears. I turned back to him, and he paced and raged again. It was an odd feeling being told off in wolf form. The images and feelings ran through your mind and body as well as through your ears. I whimpered a few times, but he ignored it, stopping only to make sure I was still paying attention. Phil hadn't stayed behind, and I was glad. Now that I remembered everything, I hoped he would stay away for good. He deserved so much better. I guess I got lost in my own thoughts. Track took another bite of my ear, and I yelped. I'm listening, I snapped back, and then yawned. Oops, Didn't mean to do that. He lowered his head and growled in my ear. Stupid! That's what it was, he snarled. When are you gonna learn, Ray? We are your pack. When you're freaking out, just ask for some time. I noticed he didn't say to ask for some space this time. Every time you run off, something happens. He was right about that. He huffed and then laid down on his stomach, facing me. Do you have any idea how important you are to all of us? Ouch. That was hitting low. I couldn't lower my head anymore, so I lowered my eyes. Not a good thing to do when you're tired. I wanted to sleep so badly, but his words stung. Then don't, I thought. Don't what? He snorted. My head shot up and a small pang of adrenaline rushed through me. Then don't love me, I said with a bark. Don't care about me at all. I'm no good. I barked again. All I do is hurt people and mess things up. I cause more problems than I fix, I snorted. I don't fix any. I turned and looked away. That was all I could muster at the moment. I was so tired. Even after my little outburst, I yawned. Track pulled back his teeth and growled. So that's it? My brows lifted and he growled again. Taking the self-pity road now? Duh, I thought, keeping that to myself. But what else did he expect? Didn't he want me to feel like crap? He snorted again, gave a hard bark, and then walked over and laid down against my back. Go to sleep, Ray. You done yelling at me? No, I'm gonna start the minute your eyes open. I smiled and sighed, laid my head down on my paw, leaned into his warm body, and closed my eyes. I was asleep instantly. When I woke up, I was nestled in a cocoon of wolves. Track was still up against my left side, but now Rock was on my right, and Jackson was partially behind me, with his head over my back. I smiled and felt their warmth. Track lifted his head and looked at me, yawning. The other two wiggled and woke up slowly. Marcus was laying closer to the fire, and he stood and stretched as well. They were all on 4 legs now. I glanced over at the bed and sighed. It was empty. I didn't blame him at all, but it did sting a little. I heard voices in the other room and tilted my head when one was a female's. Inhaling slowly, I relaxed, remembering that Ryan had agreed to let the Alsaw females come back. My best friend stood and then bowed into a hard stretch. Rock shook himself hard and I yawned to stretch my jaw muscles. They still ached, but it was tolerable now. Ready for round 2? Track thought, eyeing me. I sat up, careful to keep the splinted leg off the ground, and yawned again. Bring it on, I thought back. Rock stepped up near my head. Enough with that. Leave her alone. My eyes widened a bit, and Track lowered his head and growled at the other. Rock was bigger, but Track usually won. Let her at least wake up first, Jackson barked, trying to lighten the mood. The bedroom door opened and Ryan stepped in, with a female close behind him. Raina, this is... The name is May, little one, the older woman smiled, walking over and actually sitting on the floor in front of me. I blinked and looked up at Ryan, who shrugged with a small smile. When I looked back at the woman, she was opening a wooden box I hadn't remembered seeing her carry. Well now, let's get that splint off and have a look at that leg, shall we? She stated as she rummaged through her box. She was shorter than me, as old as Tom Tom, and was used to being in control, at least when it came to injured people. May found a pair of scissors, leaned forward, and quickly cut off the gauze that was holding the splint. She was so fast I didn't even feel it. I tilted my head and watched her face as she felt up and down my leg, her touch so gentle it didn't hurt. A long blonde braid hung over her shoulder with a leather tie holding the end. Track stepped up and leaned over to watch. She ignored him and turned back to her kit. Well, it will need a hardier splint. Then she turned back to me. I can't put a proper cast on it in case you shift. When my head tilted again, she started to pull out more things. A wolf leg and a vampire leg are not the same size. Oh, that made sense. She shot me a quick smile, then turned. Cal, bring me the blue box in the cupboard and get this girl something to eat. She looked at Track then. You boys can go have your breakfast while I finish up. It wasn't a question, and Jackson shook his body hard, showing his agitation. May looked around, seeing that the guys weren't leaving. Protectors? She asked me, and I blinked. So she looked up at Ryan, who nodded. Her brows wrinkled a bit, and she looked around the room again. All four? There was a hint of awe in her voice this time. All four, Ryan stated, but there was pride in his. Now, that is something, she replied, and then smiled at me. You are something. Now my brows wrinkled, unsure of what to make of that comment. Cal trotted in with a larger blue box in his hand, and Mike followed him in with 2 bowls. One had cut up meat, and the other fresh water. Another woman walked in, and aside from having dark hair and eyes, she looked a lot like May. Same age, same long braid, same sensible clothes, jeans, long t-shirt, and boots. She had her own small bowl in her hand, and she plopped down next to the other one. Raina, this is Beth, May explained, and I gave a soft bark to say hello. Beth smiled, and looked like she smiled a lot. May seemed more businesslike, but it was still pleasant so far. Beth scooped up something out of the bowl and then leaned over. Track moved closer, watching her. Protectors, May explained, leaning back a bit to give the other healer room. All 4 of them. Really, Beth smiled. That is truly something. She looked up at Track and then held out one of her hands, the tips covered in dark goo. This is salve. I'm going to massage it into her leg before May splints it, she explained. It will help with the pain, ease the muscles, keep infection out, and, she chuckled, all sorts of things, but all good, I assure you. May rolled her eyes but shot me a smile. Track leaned forward, and Beth patiently waited while he sniffed the mixture. He snorted and then sat down, satisfied. We all knew his nose couldn't really tell much about it, but he liked that Beth had shown him the respect. She gave a nod and turned back to me. Now, you just relax, dear. This is actually going to feel wonderful. I thought she was going to bounce a bit, but she didn't. She bent over my leg and got to work. I was amazed. Her touch was so soft and yet strong somehow. The goo worked itself in and was warm and soothing. The massage was just what she said. Wonderful. I even moaned a few times. All right now, May chuckled after several minutes. Then she winked at me. She will take the splint off and massage that leg a few times a day. Don't worry. The dark-haired healer sat back, wiping her hands on a towel, and her counterpart splinted my leg with just as much ease. Thank you, I barked. That was amazing." She said thank you and that it felt amazing. I looked up to see Phil walk into the room. My head dropped quickly and I accidentally knocked over the water bowl. Luckily, it was empty. The two women exchanged a look and I sighed. Great. Even other females did that. "You, my dear, are very welcome," Beth smiled, and I looked up at her. She nodded and started to help the other pack up the box. "Now, you will need to baby that leg for a week." Then she gasped, "Can you stay shifted that long, dear?" When I didn't respond right away, she turned and looked up at Phil. He knelt between the two women and shook his head. "No, she can't. But she should be able for the next day or two at least." "As long as she doesn't freak herself out," Jackson stated, and I turned. When did he shift back to 2 legs? Phil smiled and Ryan nodded. "High-stress situations cause her to shift without control," he explained, and I lowered my head. That was embarrassing. Most wolves were very in control of their shifting. "Well then," May said, standing up, "it is up to all of you men to make sure there is no stress on her of any kind." I looked up as she gave them a hard look and gasped inside as she shook a finger at Ryan. "I mean it. She needs to rest that leg." Beth was up and standing next to what I would have thought was her sister by their actions. 3 breaks. "Clean but complete," she added, nearly shoulder to shoulder with the other. Wow, they were a force to be dealt with when they wanted to. Remind me to stay on their good side. Ryan smiled. "We will definitely try to keep things calm." "You're going to have to do more than try," May snapped, leaning down to pick up her box. I gave a small bark, trying to explain this was all my fault. May looked back at me. "I'm sure you think this is all your fault, dear one," she shook her head, "but mark my words and my years." She turned back to the men that stood with their mouths open around her. "Where there is a female jumping out of windows and crashing over fences, there is usually a male that caused it." Wow, even my jaw dropped. Then I noticed Track try to stiffen and May shook her finger at him. "I mean what I said. No stress." And my best friend lowered his head. Wow again. I looked up at Ryan, expecting to see his jaw tight. But he was actually smiling. He winked at me and I balked, totally confused by all of this. Beth knelt back down in front of me, her brown eyes looking me over and quickly becoming moist. "You're a beautiful sight, Raina. It's been a long time since I've seen a pure black wolf." May chuckled, and I felt like I had just missed something. But she leaned over, gently kissed the top of my head, and then stood. May gave me a wink, and they both left the room. "Oh, wait, this is their room," I barked, and Beth poked her head back in. "Not to worry. We have kicked the boys out of the other room and are just as at home there. Not a word of worry about that now," she smiled, and disappeared again. I was dumbstruck, and the others just stood as quietly, all of us staring at that empty doorway. Chapter 11. Cal was the first to recover. He cleared his throat and gave a small smile. "So, anyhow, that's May and Beth, our healers," he chuckled at the end, and I gave a happy bark. I liked them. "Guess you'll have to wait for round 2, Jackson laughed, looking down at Track, who was still in wolf form. I turned and looked at my best friend, and he nipped at me playfully. "I'll wait." I moaned, and Ryan knelt then, his eyes smiling but his face stern. "That means no more running off," he stated, and my head lowered a bit. Why did grown-ups always do that? You just start feeling a little happy and they have to slap you right back down. Phil knelt next to him and my head lowered even more. Why was he still here? Part of me wished he would have thrown his hands up and left while I slept. Another part knew I would have been crushed if he did, but he would have been better off. I laid down just to keep my head as low as possible. They would all be better without me around. "Guilt is a good thing for a minute," Ryan stated, and I saw Cal and Aaron quickly leave the room. Good. Finally, I was going to get it from my alpha. The waiting was driving me a bit crazy. But you can't hide behind it. My head lifted and I looked at him. What did that mean? He nodded. "Guilt can stop you from continuing to do something stupid," Rock put in. Ryan shrugged, looking at me. "But then you have to shake it off, learn what you were meant to learn, and move on." He picked up the toppled bowl and held it out behind him. Jackson took it, and then he turned back to me. "It's time to learn to own up and move forward, Raina," he said in a soft voice. "If you don't, you will just keep nearly killing yourself," Jackson snapped, and Ryan chuckled. Phil shifted a bit, but I kept my eyes away from him. My heart ached. I missed being able to want him, to enjoy him, and to do both without the guilt that I was drowning in right now. What I did was horrible, I thought, looking at my alpha. Track barked and then Ryan stood, but Phil actually sat down in front of me. I groaned slightly, looking over at Track. "Don't look at me like that," he thought. "You need to talk to him." And with that he turned and left. They all left, and closed the door behind them. Phil was the only one left in the room, and I could hear the fire crackling in the hearth. Suddenly, I wanted to be anywhere else but here. My skin prickled and my throat tightened. The air was warm and quiet, and I couldn't tell you how long we just sat there, him looking at me, and me trying not to look at him. "He's right, you know," came Phil's voice, that both stung and felt good at the same time. I lowered my head again and then laid down, putting my jaw on my good leg. His legs were crossed in front of him, and he leaned over his lap. "I'm sorry." My head shot up then. "You? What are you sorry for?" The dark brown eyes that stared back at me were moist, and his dimple appeared as he clenched his jaw. I shouldn't have let this get out of hand. My brows wrinkled and he nodded. "I should have told you everything, right away." He sat back a little. "As soon as I realized you didn't remember, I should have made sure that you did." Okay. I was really confused now. "A part of me enjoyed it," he growled, leaning forward again. "How sick is that?" I shook my head. "What are you talking about?" I thought, so he could hear. Phil laced his hands in his lap, and he looked down at them. "It was nice having you all to myself that way," he whispered, his own guilt heavy in his words. "You didn't remember him or anything before us." His voice cracked a bit. "I liked being the only one in your heart." He spit out so quickly I had to think for a minute to realize what he said. I snorted and sat up. "Are you insane?" I barked. He lowered his head more. "I jumped through a large glass window, ran through another pack's forest, beat myself up in the process, ignored all of you, and then landed in the middle of a highway and nearly got ran over by a semi." My skin prickled a bit and my fear stood up from it. "Phil, I am the monster here, not you. I glanced around the room. I forgot my own father, all my friends, even my home. My dad must be worried sick, but I didn't even remember he existed. Then I pretended we were on vacation, played by the bonfire, and acted like there isn't a very serious situation waiting out there." He looked up then and my heart sank. "You did all of those things without knowing it. No one could fault you for that. I don't have that excuse." My ears pricked forward and he nodded. I did all the same things and knew exactly what I was doing. And I didn't care. He sighed and my heart squeezed more. I arched my neck forward a little, but he didn't move. "You did what you did for me," I tried. He shook his head. "Did I?" He gave a hard laugh. "Did I really?" My head tilted and he sighed again. "If you want to go back home, I'll take you." I sat down hard. The air went quiet again, and even the fire seemed to hold its breath. Another long pause, and I tried to sort this all out. I had been the one buried in guilt, feeling cruel and unworthy. I didn't expect him to feel the same way, and I wasn't sure how to deal with it. What he said was true, to a point. He had done all those things, knowing about my dad, about Jonathan, but he was no more evil than I was. That revelation lifted a huge weight off my heart. Neither of us were monsters. "I love you," I thought, reaching out and nuzzling his arm. He leaned into my touch, and I rubbed my jaw against him, scooting myself closer. I inhaled slowly, letting his scent fill me. I did love him, with every part of me. This was real, no matter what spooky legend named it. My heart fluttered and I smiled inside. I honestly loved Phil. I don't know why realizing that had such an effect on me, but I felt like I was floating. My mind was clear. I remembered everything, and through it all, I knew I could never be without him. I wanted to jump up and howl with happiness. It was so freeing. I still had the guilt about Jonathan. He was a wonderful guy, and I did care for him. I looked at Phil, and my heart warmed my whole body. But this went so much further than that. I closed my eyes then and forced the tingle to come. When it started, I groaned from the pain. Phil's eyes widened and he sat up. "No, you can't shift," he yelled. I smiled inside and forced the change to come. I heard him yelling as my body contorted. I think my own screams joined in at some point. No matter the need, females just had a harder time shifting. It was over quickly, though, and I found myself on the bed, wrapped in a blanket, with a handful of worried faces over me. The tears came then, but I was smiling. May pushed her way through the guys and yelled for her box. In a minute, I whispered, still out of breath. I searched the faces around me until I saw Phil. His hair was tossed and his shirt was torn a bit. My smile dipped a little, but I reached out my good hand. He moved through the mob and took it. May was mumbling something, and she lifted my broken arm, her sister next to her. I let them work on it as I looked at Phil. I love you, I smiled at him, and I saw Ryan step up next to him. He smiled down at me, and I nodded. I remember everything I said to my alpha. We'll fix this with my dad, somehow. Ryan gave me a small nod, still smiling. When I turned back to Phil, his brown eyes sparkled and he cleared his throat. May pushed him a bit as she worked over my arm, but he stayed where he was. I needed to know he still wanted me, now that I knew how much I wanted him. His eyes warmed me, and the touch of his hand sent a wonderful shiver through me. Beth whispered something, and May finally grunted and stepped out of the way, allowing Phil to sit on the bed next to me. His dimple blinked in and out as his jaw worked through his emotions, but I saw what I needed to see in his eyes. I felt it in his touch. I smiled and nodded, and finally he did the same. I let out my breath, and then he leaned over me, so we were nearly nose to nose. "This is what you want?" he whispered. I let go of his hand and put mine on the side of his face. "More than anything," I whispered back. His smile grew, and he nodded again. "I was wondering how I was going to talk you out of leaving." I giggled. "I thought you said you would take me home if I wanted to go." He shrugged. "That's what came out of my mouth, but my mind was racing with ways to keep you here." He leaned closer, and I lifted my chin just a little. "Man, get a room." We both stopped, and then Jackson grunted, followed by a thud. When I heard someone sniffle, I turned my head to see Beth and May standing back a bit, both dabbing their eyes with cloths. I bit my lower lip, and then Phil leaned to the side, putting his mouth by my ear. "Let's let them fix you up, and then we'll continue this talk." I giggled again as he sat up. Then he stood and nodded to the two women. They cleared their throats and stepped back up to me, still sniffling, but both smiling. Phil turned to Ryan, and I winced as I heard him say, "Seems we have some planning to do." And I'm going to stop there.